All right. So the next thing I wanted to talk about with regards to Rittenhouse's situation is you've written about this extensively at this point. You don't believe that he is a hero, and you believe that some people, especially on the right, are making him out to be a hero, and you think that that is problematic, right? Can you explain a little bit about your view there?
Yeah, definitely. It's a matter of fact, we know that there are people on the right who are making him out to be a hero. And I
Sure.
think the problem here is, boy, it's multiple. One is he engaged in behavior that we really don't want 17-year-olds to engage in. If there's civil unrest, the idea that somebody, just think about a lot of these people who are calling him heroes. Let's just be honest. They're keyboard posturing. How do we know that they're keyboard posturing? They would never grab a rifle and go there themselves. They would never, if they're parents, like I'm a parent, they would never say to their teenage son, "Hey, Billy, stop studying biology. Here's a rifle. Go downtown." They would never do that. Why would they never do that? It's not because they're cowards. It's because that is a reckless and foolish thing to do, to insert yourself without situational awareness, without training, into a highly volatile situation, openly armed with people you know are violent around you, is an and then also, let's just be honest about how difficult it is to suppress civil unrest. It's one of the most difficult things in law enforcement is suppressing civil unrest once it's broken out. And so it is a situation where it's just reckless. It's just reckless. Now, there's a difference between walking downtown into the middle of a riot and say, if the riot is coming to you and you have a home, defending your home, there's a difference between those are different things. And I think a lot of that has been conflated in some of this public debate. But and so why is it dangerous? Why is it reckless? Well, one of the reasons why it's dangerous and reckless is because of what we just saw, is that when you're watching the video of Rittenhouse and these shootings, what you're not watching is you're not watching somebody who's putting down a riot. You're watching somebody who's fleeing for their life, somebody who is firing the first shot really mainly to protect his gun, which then by extension protects his life, and is retreating from the scene. This isn't imposing civil order here. It's a person who got in over his head and had to shoot his way out of it to preserve his life. And that's not a model for how to deal with civil unrest by any stretch. And so, I think that one of the things that we can kind of hold two things in our head. We don't have to move to extremes. We can say, look, the state's case against him was fatally flawed. He didn't commit murder. But we can also say that we don't want 17-year-olds grabbing AR-15s and going to insert themselves into riots. That is highly destabilizing. That is not the population of people that we want doing this. There are a lot of reasons why you need people who are disciplined and trained in dealing with these kinds of circumstances. And, one quick last thing on this, because one of the things that I've heard people say is, well, the state had totally failed in its duty to maintain civil order.
Yes.
Yeah, there was absolutely no question that he was in the middle of a riot, but there is also no question that the police were executing a plan at that moment. The police had begun to end the curfew and had begun to enforce the curfew and had moved. And, when you zoom out from this, they were moving in this direction. They were moving in the direction of, as Rittenhouse showed, when he walked not far away, it was not far away, he walked into a moving line of police. And so, one of the things here is, if you say the standard is a riot has to be immediately suppressed, or we're going to grab our gun and we're going to go into a riot, or have a teenager grab a gun and go into a riot, I don't think you're understanding how difficult it is to suppress civil unrest. And then once you have your gun and you're in the middle of a violent situation and you have no plan and you have no training, let's put it this way, it's might map out a lot better in your head than it does on the street. And so that's a real problem. And then when you take somebody, a 17-year-old like that, and you turn him into a hero, what you're then doing is some small percentage of people who lack sort of this common sense to understand their limitations in this circumstance, will try to imitate him and walk in openly armed, completely untrained, no real plan, and contribute to the chaos.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of good points there, honestly. Although one, I would point out that in Kenosha, there had been already rioting that had resulted in the burning down of a car lot and other buildings the night before, right? And so this Rittenhouse and the other people who were there, I guess, were trying to prevent that again. And then the rioters who were out on the street appeared to be trying to set more fires and smash more cars when this happened. So I do think there's some question I do think that there's certainly plenty of reason to be critical of the police response and especially the governor's response in not
calling out the National Guard.
National Guard.
Right. No, I think there's a lot of reasons to be critical broadly in the summer of 2020 on failures to call out the National Guard. Suppressing urban unrest is one of the most difficult challenges that exists, not just in law enforcement, but, when we were in Iraq in counterinsurgency, suppressing urban unrest is remarkably difficult. But one of the things that you learn is that overwhelming presence can often be a substitute for overwhelming force. So in other words, overwhelming force can often exacerbate the situation by creating its own level of violence and chaos. That would think about, for example, the way in which military units treated some of the riots in the 1960s, and with an incredible amount of force. And the military has since learned that that's not exactly how you do this. And so that has resulted in changes in tactics, and presence is very, very powerful. Presence is very, very important. But so failure to call out the National Guard in many of these cities and states, I think, was a big mistake.
Right. I think for me, I'm of two minds when it comes to Rittenhouse being there at all that night. Obviously, I think you make some really good points about just generally about trying to intervene in a riot. There's sort of the old adage of this violates every rule of stupid, which is you don't go stupid places with stupid people at stupid times. Right. And a riot would be all three of those, obviously. And certainly you would, if you're going to want somebody to go down and try to protect other people's property, as Rittenhouse was attempting to do in this case, you wouldn't want to send minors, 17-year-olds, to do that. Right. I think most people would agree with that sentiment. Now, obviously, you talked about how there's a difference between going down somewhere into the riot and if a riot comes to your home. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if a riot comes to your business, that's another area where I think you're entitled to defend your business from being burned down by rioters. Now, you have to make a calculation as to whether or not it's worth your life potentially to do that, or worth taking someone else's life, of course, in this situation. And you also have the question of whether or not you should try enlisting other people to assist you in that, who aren't, your immediate family members or someone else who has an interest in the business. But you look at situations, obviously, like the rooftop Koreans, as they've been come to be called over the years, in the LA riots. And there have been also a number of businesses, Black-owned businesses, had people with guns trying to protect them during the riots. In some cities like Atlanta, you had businesses in Philadelphia where people were on the roofs with guns. When you're in a riot situation, a lot of these things become very complicated very fast. Do you just let the rioters come through and burn down everything? Do you try to intervene in an imperfect way by showing up yourself armed? That's where I think it's less cut and dry. And Rittenhouse was at least attempting to do what I think most people would believe is an honorable thing, even if there's good reasons, as you explained earlier, why you wouldn't want a 17-year-old kid to be doing that, and why there's a lot of considerations that have to go into whether or not you want to use, potentially lethal force or the threat of deadly force to protect property, is another
right
question.
Well, and all of that, a lot of that is highly regulated by state law too. So, the ability to use deadly force to protect property is not a given in the United States of America.
Right.
So, some of this is.
Well, what do you think of obviously the rooftop Koreans, the people in Koreatown and during the LA riots, the way that they banded together to defend their stores in that situation?
I don't know what the law is and was at that time. The general view, my general disposition is the use of deadly force to protect property is inappropriate. To shoot somebody to protect property and kill them, I believe that. Now, I tend to believe that the use of deadly force should be reserved for when you are in fear of death or grave bodily injury.
Right.
And so
I just would say there that, obviously, certainly it's much more troubling if you're just going to start taking random shots at people approaching your property. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to stand outside of your business with a gun during a riot as a deterrent, and then people continue to come at you to,
here's the question. Okay.
Set your place on fire.
So if you're not,
it gets blurry is what I'm saying.
Well, right. But if you're not, so if the rule is in a nation governed by the rule of law, and if the general rule is that you're not entitled to use deadly force, now your home or dwelling is a different thing. There's, where you live, sort of the traditional castle doctrine. Talking about where you live and where you lay your head at night. And there are some jurisdictions that essentially extend the castle doctrine to other kinds of places, and so, but then essentially what begins to happen is if I don't have the right to use deadly force, then why am I brandishing a weapon or carrying a weapon if I don't have the right to use deadly force? Okay, so if I don't have the right to use deadly, let's say I'm standing guard over my bicycle and I don't want someone to steal my bicycle. And then I'm carrying openly, I'm brandishing a weapon to protect my bicycle. And then essentially what then happens is the existence of the weapon itself then becomes the pretext for the use of deadly force, because then maybe somebody might try to take my weapon, as in the Rittenhouse case. And look, this is where we get to some of the difficulties when when civil unrest occurs. And so, number one, the responsibility for burning and looting rests with the rioters and the looters, and there has to be the force and the weight of law brought down on them. And then number two, you absolutely have to have effective, and again, this is something that is frustrating somewhat to talk to when you talk about civil unrest with folks who don't have any experience with trying to suppress or put down civil unrest. Once it erupts, it is very difficult to immediately and rapidly impose order. Mm-hmm. And this is something where, and then when you add on top of that, sort of the political considerations of were people too reluctant to call out the National Guard and things like that. But I think that there is a use of force to protect life. Absolutely. Use of force to protect property, use of deadly force to protect property. I'm very, very leery about that. I'm very, very leery about that.
Yeah. I understand that. And I think you're making the distinction makes a lot of sense. It's a distinction we commonly see in self-defense law. Right. But as you talked about there, when you're in a civil unrest situation, when you're in a riot situation, there are a lot of moments where the police are not, as we saw very clearly firsthand. And, you used the example of a bike, but obviously we're talking about people's livelihoods, their entire businesses being burned to the ground. A lot of them haven't recovered since then. Sure. And it's hard for me to look at somebody who wants to go out, yes, if it's a minor, perhaps should not be involved, right? I think we probably agree on that front. But it's harder for me to look at even someone like Rittenhouse, maybe I don't see a hero, but it's harder for me to see a villain either in his actions. And somebody else, a business owner who wants to stand outside of their only source of livelihood and say, please don't destroy my business.
And I'll kill you if you do.
Well, it's hard because the person aggressing and going to try and burn down, destroy their business, if they just don't, they're the ones who are initiating the negative actions, like you said. So I'm not going to say there's a clear and obvious, easy solution here. I have a hard time seeing somebody like the rooftop Koreans or the people who stood on their businesses in South Philly during the riots, or people in Atlanta who had someone standing outside to guard their business from being burned down is doing something that's morally wrong. It's morally complicated, but I do
think that it is guarding your business. Like, I absolutely, completely, totally understand that. But we're talking about, when do you use deadly force? When do you take a human life? Okay. Sure. And that businesses are very important. And I was all of these people who are online, it's just property damage. That's ridiculous to minimize the loss of a business. A human life is still more important. It's still more important.